This is a quick video on how to assemble Anderson connectors. I need to make some for something I'm working on here in my solar setup, so I thought I'd go ahead and show you guys how they're made if you weren't aware. The XT60 is much more popular than these days. I'm not sure why, because if you've ever soldered an XT60 connector with 10 gauge wire, it's a pain unless you solder every day, and most of us don't. These are a lot easier. Just requires a crimping tool, and then you slide them into the connector here. This is a tool designed to crimp Anderson lugs. It is not required. I have used a normal hydraulic or even handheld crimper that you can use from normal cable on these as well. This is a little more convenient, works a little bit quicker in some cases than like a hydraulic one does, but you can buy these for 30 or 40 bucks on Amazon, or just use the crimper you may already have in your arsenal. The most common size you'll probably see is the Anderson 50 because it handles up to 50 amps. And these are common on a lot of battery chargers, for example, especially with golf carts and things of that nature. Then you have the Anderson 175, which of course can handle a lot more current at 175 amps. And as you can tell, the size of the lugs are a lot different. This is designed for 2 gauge. I have other ones that are up to 1/0, and this is designed, of course, for a maximum of 50 amps. The one I'm going to be doing today is actually a 50 amp one, and these are meant for, I believe, 6 to 10 gauge wire. I'm using 8 gauge today. So all you got to do to start with here is crimp the ends on. Before you crimp these, you need to understand how these go into the connector. If you look closely, there is a little claw on the end of this. That claw engages the metal tabs inside the connector. So when you slide this in, it's going to go in with the flat side down and the claw down and into the connector. So when you're about to crimp these, make sure you get if you've already installed your cable ends with your lugs, make sure that you get them in the right orientation, otherwise you may find yourself in a tough spot if your wires aren't very long. The way they like to crimp these with this crimper is get the jaws just high enough that they can allow the end to slip in, and then squeeze it with your hand here so that it holds the end in there. Insert your wire. And some of these can be pretty tough, so I usually like to put the crimper on the table like this, and then push down like that until you get a good crimp. On this design of a crimper, it crimps it by putting a dent or impression into the end of the connector. Now, if you're worried that this may pull out, especially if you're using a smaller gauge of wire, you can flip the cable over, put it back in the crimper 180 degrees off, and go ahead and crimp it again. That will give you a crimp on this side as well as on this side. And then you don't need to put any kind of heat shrink on here or anything like that to protect the ends if you don't want to. You can if you want to. Then all you do is make sure that you pay attention to the negative and positive symbols on the connector here, because they are labeled here for you. Make sure you don't put the cable in the wrong side, because you can take these apart. It's kind of a pain, so I would not suggest doing it. Make sure your claw is facing down, so basically claw to the flat side, and slide it in. Push. Now it's good and secure. And you can see the claw has locked into the metal tab in the connector. Then you just do the same thing for the positive. It's pretty easy, and a lot easier than soldering an XT60 connector. Trust me on that. So now we'll do the same for the positive side. Again, insert your wire. Crimp. And if you're paranoid like me, flip it over and crimp it again. sometimes you do get a bit of a mush on the connector end. Doesn't matter if it slides in and does not come off the cable end, you ain't going to see it anyway. So then we'll simply take our connector, make sure the claw side is facing up and the flat side is facing up. We'll simply slide it into the connector, push it home till it clicks, make sure it doesn't come out, and that is your completed Anderson connector. It's that easy. Click, click, and a couple of crimps. And that is why I'm starting to use these for everything instead of XT60 connectors, especially when I can do the same thing with much larger cables using the Anderson 175 connector. These are used a lot in forklifts, for example, so like your electric forklifts, and a lot of other things as well. A lot of off-road guys use them as well. There is a larger connector even than this you can use too for even larger cable, but these are probably the two most common sizes. Now, if you screw up and put the negative on the positive side or vice versa, then you can go ahead and actually disassemble these. You can also disassemble it if you have a damaged wire, for example, and you want to replace the wire without having to replace the entire connector. For that, it can be a little bit tricky. The goal here is to get your small flathead screwdriver up underneath the claw and pry up just enough to flex the connector or the claw off of the metal spring tab inside of the connector. It can be a bit of a problem. It might take you a few tries. But you will eventually manage to work the screwdriver up under the metal tab inside the connector and then pull it out. And then all you have to do is either make up your new cable or whatever you want to do, or flip it around and then just go ahead and snap it back in just like that. So they are very forgiving compared to something like an XT60 connector. Another big advantage of the Anderson style connector is they are hermaphroditic. That means there is no male, there is no female. They're all the same. So you don't have to worry about if you have a cable that has a male end or a female end like you do with XT60. They're all the same. So you just take your connector, they're both identical. You don't need to buy different types. And you just go ahead and put them together, push, and they snap together. And when you want to take them apart, they come apart that easy as well. So all I can say is I really like these things, and I would suggest instead of buying a soldering iron and a bunch of XT60 connectors, just buy these instead.